Well, y'all, it's done got hotter in Louisiana. Let me start with this question right here. Should a race ever be used? Let me just rephrase that again. Should race ever be used when drawing political maps? Because that is exactly what this is at the center of a major court ruling out of Louisiana, okay? And in case you have not heard, this went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And this is one that could reshape how the representation works across this entire country. Now, y'all already know we got Virginia in the hot seat. New England, that show is going to come up next because there's some issue with that up there. So let me just bring this down to lowest common denominator so you understand exactly what's going on. A court struck down Louisiana's congressional map saying lawmakers went too far in using race to create a majority black district, okay? Now, supporters, they are trying to argue that this restores fairness, okay? But the critics say that it weakens protections for minority voters. So what actually happened and why does this matter to John Q. everyday public? So everybody knows that every 10 years after the census, states can redraw congressional districts because of the population, and that process is called redistricting, okay? Now, Louisiana, like many states, has a complex racial and political history. If you've ever been to Louisiana, you know the person that you're talking to might look black, but they could be black, Creole, Japanese, and a little bit of Irish. That's just what it is, okay? The state itself, however, is about 1/3 black, but historically had only one majority black congressional district out of 6 of them, okay? After the most recent census, which would have been 2010, legal challenges were filed arguing that the map didn't fairly represent black voters. Now, a lower court initially agreed. They pushed it for a second majority black district. Of course, lawmakers revised the maps, and this is when things escalated. And ultimately, a court that revised map, well, I should say the court ruled that the revised map went too far using race as a factor. The key issue wasn't just whether race was considered, but how heavy it was used. That's the argument. So let's talk about the legal reasons as to why this jumped off the way that it did. This gets into the tension between 2 legal principles: the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause. So the Voting Rights Act was designed to prevent racial discrimination in voting. Sometimes requires drawing districts that give minority voters a fair chance to elect candidates. However, the Equal Protection Clause says the government cannot treat people differently based on race without a significant justification. And here's where the conflict comes in. And this is something that you need to understand. So if you ignore race entirely, you might dilute minority voting power, okay? If you focus on race too much, courts may say that you're engaging in racial gerrymandering. The court's conservative majority argued the map relied too heavy on race, which I sort of kind of tend to agree, but district lines were drawn primarily to hit racial targets rather than to follow traditional boundaries. That is where I have the issue more than anything. So in their view, that crosses a constitutional line. Now, I agree with this because of the gerrymandering that happened in Maryland. We're going to get to that in a minute. The debate, should race be taken out? And this is where things start to get crazy. Supporters of the ruling say districts should be drawn race neutral. Focusing on race divides voters rather than uniting them, and it prevents politicians from engineering outcomes. They argue voters should choose representatives, not the other way around. The counterpart to this is race still matters. Critics say ignoring race ignores real-world inequality. Voting patterns and historical discrimination don't disappear just because you stop considering race, and without protections, minority voters may lose meaningful representation. They argue you can't fix inequality by pretending that it doesn't exist. Now, why does this matter nationally? I'm going to take you back to Maryland. They tried to redraw the lines. Maryland is heavy Democratic simply because of 4 places: Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Prince George's County, and Montgomery County. The heavy population in central Maryland is, for the most part, blue. Everything else in the state of Maryland is pretty much red. And because they wanted to phase out one of those red seats, they started playing with the lines again. Well, the problem is you have 2/3 of the state. We're not talking about just central Maryland. We're talking about the entire state. We have 2/3 of the state that's red, that they're not being represented. The same thing Maryland tried to do, Virginia just tried to do. And similarly, Louisiana tried to push through something, close to that. But here's why it matters nationally. Let's get to that. It just isn't about Louisiana. The ruling could influence how maps are drawn in other states. In other words, had this floated, Virginia may have been able to hold some water. It affects the balance of power in Congress because, as you know, unless you've been living under a rock, everything right now is about the balance of power in Congress. One side trying to get the other side back and vice versa, okay? It shapes the future of court cases based on voting rights. That joker right there is where you don't understand how deep that is. And it also raises this bigger question, okay? Are we moving toward a system where race plays less a role, or are we moving, or I should say this, are we removing safeguards too soon? Yeah, that's the question. So here's the reality of this, okay? The court didn't say that race can never be considered. So for the Democrats out there that are saying, oh my gosh, this is, whatever, the court never said that. Please don't lie on them. They did not say that. It said race cannot be the dominant factor. You already know if you're going to tell it, you got to tell it like it is and shoot it straight, because anything else is a lie. And for anybody to stand up and say that the court said that race can never be considered, I'm telling you, you are telling a lie. So the real question isn't should race be removed? It's where do we draw the line between fairness and overreach? And that is something the country is still trying to figure out. So if you found this breakdown helpful, follow the show. Please share it and let somebody know. Or I should say this, don't let somebody, let me know. Should race play any role in redistricting at all? You heard it from Keon right here on Something to Talk About.